Hello and welcome to the fifth lecture of the series Basic Cognitive Processes. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. We are still talking about foundational assumptions in cognitive psychology. If you remember, in the last class we talked about the scientific approach to mind and how that has been used to explain behavior. More specifically, we talked about the behaviorist explanations. We talked about how the stance of behaviorism explains human behavior. In today's class, we will talk about the cognitivist view. Now, what is the cognitivist view? The cognitivist view basically assumes that there is an abstract entity called the mind, and that this abstract entity is composed of these mental states and mental processes. It is concerned with exploring the nature of these mental processes. That is what cognitive psychology is meant to do. Now, cognitive psychology then may be defined as the study of the mind to the extent that we can generate testable statements about these abstract entities, because you want to talk about these in a scientific manner. So, you want to generate predictions, you want to test those predictions and accept or reject them on the basis of those particular tests. How do we do that? We can do that if we operate within a framework where we can make certain assumptions. So, we made a particular assumption that this mental state leads to that kind of behavior, and then what we can do is we can test these assumptions. We can create particular very specific hypotheses and go out and test them. Importantly though, however, for our science to work properly, we must generally we must attempt to generate falsifiable theories. Okay. So, unless our theory is falsifiable, we will not really be able to test it. Say for example, if you create a aircraft, you want to market this aircraft, somebody asks you that how strong your aircraft is or what all this aircraft is capable of doing. So, you would want to test it, you want to really test its metal before really promising to the to your customers. So, when do you choose to test it? You do not really want to test it on a clear day and a sunny day where there is no wind and the chances of it failing are anyways minimal. You would want to test it in the hardest of the flying conditions and you want to see whether the aircraft performs well or it does not perform well. That is what will give you some degree of confidence that if I sell this aircraft, the person flying this will not really end up in an accident. Okay. This is pretty much what we want to do with our theories. We want to really make our theories which are open to testing and can be falsified, and then we see that whether they stand the rigor of a test or they do not stand the rigor of a test. That is what we want to do in cognitive psychology. Karl Popper basically talks about attributes of how good a theory is or how do you really evaluate a theory. So, he gives us a few points. He says that a theory should be easy to verify. So, if I go and say that the sun rises in the east, you might be just quickly turn your head towards the east, see whether at a particular time, obviously see whether the sun is there or not, or sun is rising from there or not. It should be very easy to verify. Second is it should be refutable, or else it will not be scientific. If I say something like, say for example, God has done something, it is not something that I can go and refute. I will never get the idea that God has done this or not. So, then it is not really a scientific theory because it cannot be tested. Also, a genuine test of the theory is any attempt to falsify it. If you really want to test a theory, you want to attempt to falsify it. You want to really test what are the conditions in which this theory will hold and what are the conditions in which this theory will not hold. Confirming evidence about the test or about any theoretical prediction that you make is not really counted. It is not really given a lot of weight unless it is a genuine test of the theory. Okay. Unless you test it and then you find confirming evidence, that is that is only acceptable in that case. Acha. Let us move ahead. Now, in line with the above, cognitive psychologists also try to do a similar thing. They are basically allowed to posit abstract entities on the assumption that they can be tested in this scientific way. Theories therefore in cognitive psychology must be testable, refutable and falsifiable. Further, theories in cognitive psychology should also be extremely simple. That is again one of the things that Popper said, that theories should be simple. It should not have that if x leads to y leads to z and leads to d, then only you can say that x leads to d. There should not be so many conditions in the middle. Okay. Now, let us take an example. If I want you to compare this two mental operations, compare 14 into 5 versus 17 into 3, how do you do this comparison? Okay, although we all differ in our ability to carry out this calculation, from a cognitive perspective it seems fairly reasonable to assume that this ability depends upon some mental representations, mental representations of what multiplication is, mental representation of what numbers are. These kind of mental representation at least should be common to everyone. Now, whether the cognitive explanation, so something also somebody can ask is whether a cognitive explanation is necessary for this kind of mental arithmetic. You could simply say that there is a physical device in your head which really does this calculation. Okay. So let us say if there is a physical device, maybe it is, say for example, like this balance beam. Okay. If there is more weight on one side, then the number is more, then the resultant is more. If there is more weight on the other side, the resultant is less. We can say that, but can we use this physical explanation for many other calculations as well? So the dilemma is, while cognitive psychologists would obviously wish to offer a cognitive explanation for the brain for human behavior, whether they would want to have ascribe this cognitive explanation to the balance beam as well. Okay. And how do you then solve this? How do you really say that, okay, the balance beam is a physical device and I want to give a cognitive explanation? You have to understand that while the balance beam can do some of your calculations, it can do some simple multiplications, some other addition, subtraction, division, something like that, but at the level of the special purpose mechanistic approach to this mental multiplication which is offered by this balance beam actually fails to provide a more comprehensive explanation of how this is done. It does not really talk about how the numbers were represented, how exactly this process of multiplication took place. Okay. It will not be able to explain that in entirety. Humans on the other hand can handle a versatile range of calculations. We do a lot of different calculations, and that those calculations cannot be handled by simple physical devices such as the balance beam. So there is some merit to actually have this cognitive explanation of human behavior. We will go ahead and see how. So why do you really want to talk about this? Why do you really want to talk about this mental explanation? So in order to understand this, we have to talk about how this mental and physical is related, how the mind, which is an abstract entity, is related to the brain, which is a physical entity. Let us look at possibilities. One of the possibilities is offered in this theory called the central state identity theory. The central state identity theory says that our mental lives are intimately connected with the things that go on in our brains. So anything that you do, any mental activity that takes place can be mapped back onto any neural activity that happens in the brain. Say for example, brain damage sometimes leads to loss of memory, loss of language, loss of understanding, things like that. Okay, so that relationship can be made. That part is at least clear. Various attempts, that is why, have been made to explore the mapping between these mental events and neurological events. You will see people actually trying to do various investigations into how a particular neural event in the brain can lead to a particular mental event in your mind, so to speak. The assumption is that two are related, and the only doubt or the only confusion is how are they related, and that is what basically cognitive psychology or cognitive neuroscience is really investigating. So the central state theory basically forms the foundation of all the work in your cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience, etc. There are two versions of this theory. First is the type identity theory. So you can say that each type of mental event maps onto a different kind of neural event. Okay. Say for example, remembering to perform a particular task X corresponds to one kind of event which is happening in the one kind of nerve cells firing, and choosing not to perform the task X actually is basically based on the another kind of nerve cells firing. Okay. So each type of event is related to different types of neurons which fire in the brain. Now this is one explanation. Now one has to be very careful when we use words like maps onto or corresponds to, because saying these terms will actually lead us to the materialist thing that there is a one-to-one correspondence between neural events and mental events. We have to be a bit careful with that, and we will see in the next slides how. Now if you take an example, if you hurt yourself, the defining element of pain will be the sensation of hurting. Now this peculiar thing about pain is that pain is not merely a sensation, but it is also a matter of perceptions. Some people with the same degree of hurt might not feel that amount of pain. So pain is also, it's not only sensation, it's also perception. Okay, you will be sensing that certain degree of tissue has been damaged or something like that has happened, but your perception of that entire pain actually directly corresponds to your pain tolerance. If your tolerance is rather high, you might feel less pain with the same amount of hurt as somebody who's got a low tolerance of pain. Now, this is something which is rather interesting and kind of creates problems for the type identity theory. So, the problem with identity theory is that it seems to force different things to be the same. So, there is this feeling of pain which is a mental event, and there is the pattern of nerve cell firing which is a physical event. We are trying to have a one to one or the same basically trying to say that these two are the same things. Okay. So, if one follows this perspective, this materialist perspective, we assume that everyone's experience is perfectly predicted by everyone's neural activity, whatever is happening in each of our brains. Now, Searle basically created some objections for this kind of position. He says that there is something called the different brains problem. Now, take this example. Jones thinks it might rain, and then nerve cells A, B, C and D fire. Smith thinks that Smith's brain is different from Jones' brain. There are different kinds of connections, the structures. There is obviously a lot of individual differences in the brains. Any rudimentary book on neuroscience will tell you that. Now, the point is, say for example, when Smith is thinking the same thought that it might rain, different set of neurons are firing E, F, G and H. Okay. Now, the point is, this is the problem we are talking about. Both men are actually entertaining the same thought, but different neurons are firing for the same thought. Now, this cannot happen within the framework of the type identity theory. Okay. This is the basic problem. So, from this problem actually comes another version of this identity theory, which is your token identity theory. What does it say? It says that mental events correspond to neurological events, but there is a acceptance that there may be a variety of neurological events that may lead to the same kind of a mental event. Okay, say for example, in this framework then it becomes really possible that different sets of neurons like A, B, C and D or E, F, G and H are actually leading to the same kind of a mental event, that is thinking of rain. Okay. As it stands, token identity theory's brand of materialism is the one which is providing the foundation for all kinds of work in cognitive neuroscience. That is where the field of cognitive neuroscience is really based. We will talk about cognitive neuroscience in more detail in probably our second chapter. Even this version actually, if you really examine closely, may run into difficulties concerning the understanding of subjective experience. So, but we will actually not go into much more detail, we will stop here and we will assume that this is okay and we will need to move on with other things. On a different note, if we accept that patterns of nerve cells firings may give rise to the same thought, we also need to be sure about what is it in these nerve cells firing that is leading to a particular kind of a thought. That is also what we will need to investigate, and we will see that in the coming lectures. Now, moving to a different question, functions. What is a function? Function is basically the purpose of anything or what something does. Okay. Say for example, the function of the umbrella is to save you from rain, or the function of the chalk is to write on the blackboard. Now, there are two things. There is this concept of structure and the concept of function. So, the structure of something then could be different from its function. Okay. What is the physical makeup of something and what it does are two slightly different things. So, what are we, when do we talk about function? Let us say when we want to have a functional description of something. So, if you want to have a functional description of, let us say, a car's engine, what do we really want? If you want a full understanding of what a car's engine does, you would want to know the structure of its components, you would want to know how these are connected, and you want to also know how what roles each of these components are playing. This right here is pretty much what is the functional description of a car's engine. So, there is a petrol tank, it's connected to the petrol pump and the carburetor and the piston chamber, which is connected to an AC diode. But you do not find this explanation complete unless you know what each of these things does. What is the function of the petrol tank, what is the function of the petrol pump, what is the function of the carburetor. Unless you understand those things, you will not understand what it is, what basically a car engine does. Pretty much what it is true for the human brain as well. You might know the structure, but you need to know the functions more importantly. So, that is why it helps to have a functional description of the component. That is what will actually really further your understanding. traditionally such a design eventuates in something which is called the schematic diagram, which we just saw. Okay, such a diagram specifies each component and shows how each component is connected with other components. Also, such a diagram reveals the flow of control between various components, what is linked to what in what order, what is the hierarchy. Let us say, what, does the brain control your limbs or the limbs control your brain? Those kind of questions can be asked. Another interesting aspect of this concept of functions is that at the level of the diagram, we are not so bothered about how close the different concepts are to one another. Whether the pump is next to the tank or the carburetor, we just want to see how they are connected. However, if we embellish the structural information with the description of the functions of the individual, then the diagram becomes much more useful for us for understanding the car engine. In our case, such a description will allow us to discuss each of the individual components in the abstract without committing to the physical entities. So, we can say there is a petrol engine which does this, there is a carburetor which does that, and our explanation could be purely a functional explanation. That is pretty much what we attempt for the brain while we are talking about the cognitive psychology part. The focus basically shifts to the function and not so much to the structure. Okay. This stream of thought in cognitive psychology is what is called functionalism. It is now possible to see that how two different brain states may underlie the same mental state, okay, because we are concerned about functions of those brain states, okay, which basically is to lead to particular mental states. So, as long as the two neurophysiological states serve the same functional role, then they can obviously capture the same mental state. Okay. So, mental state X can then be defined purely in terms of its function. Okay. This basically is what the crux of functionalism is. Function is then defined in terms of causation. Okay. What leads to what? So, a mental state X has a particular function insofar it leads to the same consequences, be the new mental states or the same form of behavior. So, a mental state could X could lead to new mental states, or it could lead to some particular form of behavior. So, you feel happy leads you to eat an ice cream, something like that. For example, Anne thought it was going to rain and remembered that she had left her kitchen window open. Okay. She had to go and close it. So, here the mental state of thinking about rain leads to the mental state of remembering that she had left her kitchen open, and it leads to the physical behavior of action Z. Okay. So, as long as the functional description of the mental states and processes is the same for different individuals, then our understanding of the particularities of the underlying neural apparatus will be generalizable. So, as long as we know that the function of this area is this and the function of this particular brain area is that, to that extent we will be successfully able to explain or give theoretical models or theoretical explanations of particular kinds of human behavior. So somebody has higher memory, somebody has lower memory, and that can lead to somebody remembering more information or somebody remembering less information. Remember, in this explanation I am not really talking about somebody having more brain cells or more neurons or less neurons, or better connected neurons or less connected. I am not really referring to that at all. I am just talking about memory. See, the entire description then is just rested on something which is rather abstract. This is pretty much what we do in cognitive psychology. So, to sum up, the cognitivist view of mind and behavior basically allows the assumption of abstract entities as theoretical basis of human behavior. So, you assume these abstract mental entities, mental functions, and you use these abstract mental entities to actually talk about human behavior. Also, it stresses also this cognitive viewpoint basically stresses on the generation of scientifically testable assumptions. Okay, whichever assumptions you generate should be scientifically testable. That is what how it will remain in the framework of cognitive psychology. Okay, and this basically these are basically used to explain human behavior in a simple and testable scientific manner. Okay, it is not really as deterministic as the behaviorist paradigm, but it still does a good job of being tested or being falsified and then being accepted or rejected. Okay. Further, it also calls for a functional description rather than a material description of human behavior. Now, this last point is the most important point which you would like to keep in mind. When we are talking about cognitive psychology, when we are talking about different mental functions in cognitive psychology, more often than not we are actually only talking about the functional aspects. We are not really talking about the neural aspects. We do talk about the neural aspects to some detail. In every cognitive psychology paper there is a reference to that this happens, and this happens because of this is activity in the human brain. So, this is something which you would need to keep in mind. So, here I will close the lecture of today, and we will talk about the another aspects of another assumptions in cognitive psychology in the next class. Thank you.